Handing a note to Damian Blackwood, the alpha of the city's most ruthless syndicate, was a guaranteed death sentence for a no-name Omega waiter like me. My hands shook violently as I stood in the shadows of the Velvet Rose, though not from the single drop of Merlot staining the linen napkin I clutched against my chest. The restaurant glittered around me like a cage of golden lies, chandeliers dripping crystal tears onto patrons who had never worried about rent in their privileged lives. I was 22 years old and bonded, and choking on the sickeningly sweet scent of his fiancé's deception. The hastily scrawled message in my trembling hand read, "Your fiancé sold you out. Pier 17. Midnight." I knew staying silent would be worse than speaking up. I knew because I had spent 3 years learning to read people the way other Omegas learned to bake cookies or arrange flowers, out of pure desperate necessity. My name is Caleb Foster, and I was about to commit career suicide in the most spectacular fashion possible. The Velvet Rose was the kind of establishment where a single appetizer cost more than my weekly salary, where the wine cellar held bottles older than my deceased mother, and where the secrets whispered over dry-aged steak could level city blocks. It occupied the top 3 floors of a chrome and glass tower in the financial district, offering panoramic views of the skyline that made the filthy rich feel like gods looking down upon their kingdom. As an unbonded Omega, I wasn't supposed to be working the floor. Management required all Omegas to be heavily dosed on prescription suppressants, chemical blockers that turned our natural scent into something sterile, something invisible, so we wouldn't distract the high-paying alpha clientele. The theory was that alphas couldn't control themselves around an Omega's natural pheromones, so the Omegas had to pay the price. Literally, the suppressants came out of our paychecks. I had been on them since I was 18, when I fled my pack's rural territory with nothing but a stolen duffel bag and a black eye. The city had chewed me up and spit me out more times than I could count, but I had survived. I waited tables, I kept my head down, and I never ever drew attention to myself. Survival in this city meant being invisible, especially when the Blackwood family walked through the mahogany doors. Damian Blackwood didn't just walk into a room. He owned it before his foot touched the floor. At 34, he was the undisputed head of the Blackwood Syndicate, a man whose reputation for surgical brutality was matched only by his terrifying composure. They said he had personally gutted his own uncle to take control of the organization at 25. They said he hadn't blinked while doing it. When he arrived that Tuesday evening, the entire atmosphere of the restaurant shifted. The ambient chatter didn't just die down, it evaporated. Waiters straightened their spines. Patrons suddenly became fascinated with their wine glasses. Even through my suppressants, the sheer weight of his alpha presence, a sharp, devastating wave of crushed cedar, dark whiskey, and something electric like lightning just before a storm, made the hair on my arm stand up. Every Omega in the room felt a primal biological urge to lower their gaze, including me. Especially me. On his arm was Julian Ashford. Julian was everything an alpha like Damian was supposed to want. 26 years old, a high-society Omega from the Ashford shipping fortune, with cheekbones that could cut glass and a smile that had graced the covers of every lifestyle magazine in the tri-state area. His hair was the color of spun gold, artfully tousled to look effortless. His suit, a pale lavender number that probably cost more than my entire existence, fit his slender frame like it had been grown on him. His scent was a cloying, heavy blend of white jasmine, honey, and something artificially sweet like cotton candy at a carnival. It was the scent of someone who had never been told no in his entire privileged life. To the rest of the room, they were the perfect power couple. Their engagement had been announced just 6 weeks prior in the society pages, complete with a 12-page spread and a photo shoot at the Ashford family estate. The union was meant to solidify a massive shipping merger that would give the Blackwood Syndicate control of the entire eastern seaboard's import traffic. But I had a gift. Or perhaps a curse. The suppressants I took dulled my own scent into non-existence. A blessing, really, since my natural scent was nothing special, just rain, old paper, and something faintly like wild mint. But they didn't dampen my olfactory receptors. In fact, after 3 years of chemical bombardment, my sense of smell had become almost painfully hypersensitive to the pheromones of others. And beneath Julian's expensive perfume and sweet floral notes, I could smell the rot. It was subtle at first, a sour metallic tang of pure adrenaline-fueled anxiety, like copper pennies and stale sweat. It was the scent of a liar. The scent of someone who was wound so tightly with fear and deception that it was leaking out of his pores despite his best efforts to hide it. I had been smelling it on Julian for 3 weeks now, every time he came in with Damien. It started faint, then grew stronger with each visit. Tonight, it was almost overwhelming, clashing violently with his jasmine perfume like oil and water. I was assigned to their private booth, a secluded alcove draped in velvet curtains, overlooking the city lights that sparkled like spilled diamonds below. It was the most prestigious table in the restaurant, reserved exclusively for Damien Blackwood and his guests. And tonight, I was the lucky waiter who got to serve them. Lucky me. Through the appetizer course, oysters on the half shell, and a foie gras tranche that probably cost 3 months of my student loan payments, Julian played the doting fiancé to perfection. He laughed softly at something Damien said. He rested his manicured hand on Damien's forearm, his fingers tracing idle patterns on the expensive fabric of his charcoal suit jacket. He tilted his head just so, letting the candlelight catch the diamonds in his earlobes. Damien was polite. He nodded at appropriate moments. He made the expected responses. But his eyes, the color of tarnished silver, cold and assessing, were constantly scanning the room. He radiated an exhausted, heavy power, like a predator who had been awake for days, waiting for something to go wrong. He reminded me of a wolf I had once seen in a sanctuary, pacing the perimeter of its enclosure, never resting, never trusting. "I'll need the 05 Bordeaux, Caleb," Damien ordered, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that sent a completely involuntary shiver down my spine. He didn't look at me when he spoke, he never did, but he knew my name. He knew the names of all the staff who served him. It was part of his terrifying attention to detail. And make sure it breathes properly this time. Last week's was corked. "Right away, Mr. Blackwood," I murmured, bowing my head and backing away from the table, the way I had been trained to do. Never turn your back on an alpha predator. Never make sudden movements. Never, ever meet their eyes unless invited. Retrieving the vintage meant taking the long hallway past the private VIP restrooms, a secluded corridor, heavily soundproofed and reserved for the restaurant's most elite guests. The walls were lined with sound-absorbing velvet, the floors thick with carpet that swallowed footsteps. It was designed for discretion, for conversations that could never leave this floor. As I approached the wine cellar, I saw a sliver of light spilling from one of the private parlor doors. It was slightly ajar, maybe an inch, maybe less. I wouldn't have stopped, wouldn't have cared, would have walked right past and gone about my miserable life, if I hadn't recognized the overpowering, aggressive stench of a Volkov enforcer leaking into the hallway. The Volkov Bratva were the Blackwood Syndicate's fiercest rivals, Russian Mafia transplants who had been trying to claw their way into the city's shipping ports for years. They were monsters, every last one of them. 2 years ago, they had firebombed a warehouse district where my cousin worked. He survived, but he couldn't look at open flames for 6 months without having a panic attack. They had also driven my father's small trucking business into the ground 5 years ago, leaving him a broken, bitter shell of a man who drank himself to death last spring. I hadn't spoken to him in 3 years before he died. I wasn't sure if that made me sad or relieved. I pressed my back against the silk-lined wall, my breathing going shallow. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was terrified someone might hear it. Through the crack in the door, I heard Julian's voice, but stripped of its usual sweet, melodic lilt. Gone was the soft laughter and the adoring sighs. In its place was something sharp, demanding, and utterly ruthless. "I don't care about your delays, Nikolai," Julian hissed, and I could hear the venom dripping from every syllable. "Damien is moving the entire weapons shipment to Pier 17 tonight at midnight. He's overseeing it personally. He thinks the decoy at the rail yard will draw you off." A heavily accented voice chuckled, low, wet, and cold. Nikolai Volkov, the Bratva's second in command. I had seen his face on the news once, before the story was conveniently buried. And the security codes, little bird. Alpha 7 Tango Niner. Julian didn't hesitate. Didn't pause. He recited the code like he was ordering coffee. You wire the remaining $7 million to the offshore account by 11, or the deal is off. A pause, and then Julian's voice dropped even lower, so quiet I had to strain to hear. And Nikolai, make sure he doesn't survive. If Damien lives, I'm a dead man. He'll hunt me to the ends of the earth. Don't worry, pretty thing, Nikolai sneered, and I could hear the smirk in his voice. By tomorrow morning, you will be a tragic, wealthy widower. And the docks will belong to us. The Blackwood name will mean nothing but a bad memory. My blood ran ice cold. My hands gripped the service tray, so tightly my knuckles turned white. I could feel the edge of the silver digging into my palms, a sharp pain that anchored me to reality. Julian Ashford. The perfect fiancé. The golden boy of high society. He was selling the most dangerous man in the city to his worst enemies. For $7 million and a way out. I didn't wait to hear more. I didn't peer through the crack to see if I could catch a glimpse of their faces. I slipped away, my shoes silent on the carpet, my breath locked in my chest like a caged animal. I practically sprinted to the wine cellar, ducking inside and pressing my forehead against the cool metal of the wine racks, trying to slow my racing heart. My mind was spinning. The logical thing, the safe thing, was to forget what I had heard. Damien Blackwood was a mafia boss. He ran drugs and weapons and God only knew what else. He had killed people. He had ruined lives. If he died, the world wouldn't shed a tear. But if the Volkovs took over the docks, the collateral damage to the lower-class neighborhoods, to people like me, to my cousin who was still trying to rebuild his life, would be catastrophic. The Volkovs didn't care about collateral damage. They didn't care about bodies in the streets. They were animals. More than that, though, and this was the part that made me feel sick with myself, a deep, irrational part of my omega biology recoiled at the sheer treachery of it. To betray your bonded, or soon-to-be bonded, alpha like that, it was a violation of the most primal laws of our kind. I didn't care about Damien Blackwood. I didn't owe him anything. But the thought of what Julian was doing made my stomach twist with a revulsion I couldn't explain. I grabbed the 05 Bordeaux from the rack. I grabbed a pen from my apron. And on a pristine white cloth napkin, my hand trembling so violently I could barely form the letters, I wrote the words that would change my life forever. Your fiancé sold you out. Pier 17. Midnight. Walking back onto the floor felt like walking to the gallows. Every step was heavy, my legs moving through molasses. The restaurant's ambient music, a low jazzy saxophone that usually faded into the background, sounded like a funeral dirge. My pulse pounded in my ears so loudly I was terrified the alphas in the room could hear it, could smell the fear pouring off me despite my suppressants. I approached the booth. Julian was swirling a glass of sparkling water, smiling radiantly at Damien. It's just that the wedding planner thinks the peonies will clash with the centerpieces, he was saying, his jasmine scent thick and cloying, and how had no one else noticed the way it curdled at the edges? What do you think, darling? Damien didn't look at him. His dark eyes were fixed on the street below, watching the headlights cut through the evening fog like knives through silk. Do whatever makes you happy, Julian. You know, I don't care about the flowers. I stepped up to the table, the Bordeaux bottle clutched in my right hand, the stained napkin hidden in my left. Though 5 Bordeaux, sir, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Damien's silver eyes flicked to me for a fraction of a second, then away. He nodded once, a sharp, dismissive gesture. I uncorked the bottle, a skill I had perfected over 3 years of this job, and began to pour. My hands betrayed a slight tremor, just a tiny shake that I hoped looked like nothing more than the normal nervousness of an omega serving an apex alpha. And then, as if guided by fate itself, a single drop of the dark red wine fell from the bottle's lip and landed on the folded napkin I held in my left hand. A perfect, blooming stain of crimson against the white linen. Perfect, Julian said, not even looking at me. Damien, did you see the new Bugatti the shipping manager bought? Tacky, right? I finished the pour and stepped back. In that split second while Damien's eyes were closed, he always closed his eyes to take in the bouquet of a good wine. I had noticed this over months of serving him. I moved. I placed the stained napkin down flat on the mahogany table, right next to his hand. Deliberately, carefully, I slid it so the words faced him. Then I placed the bottle down and stepped back, holding the silver serving tray against my chest like a shield. Damien opened his eyes. He looked down to set his glass back on the table. Then he saw the napkin. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything except stand there, frozen, waiting for the world to end. Damien's reaction was microscopic to the untrained eye, terrifying if you knew what to look for. His jaw tightened, a single muscle jumping near his temple, there and gone in a heartbeat. The casual, relaxed posture of his broad shoulders vanished, replaced instantly by coiled, predatory tension. His breathing didn't change. His expression didn't shift. But his eyes went from tarnished silver to something darker, something older, something that had seen too much blood and was not afraid to see more. And then there was his scent. The subtle cedar and whiskey spiked violently, turning acrid, burning the air like a live wire. The electric undertone crackled and snapped, filling the space around him with the ozone smell of an impending storm. The sheer force of his alpha pheromones hit me so hard that my knees actually buckled, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. I had to lock my legs to keep from collapsing. Julian, oblivious to the text in the napkin, but hit by the sudden wave of pheromones, frowned. His hand hovered in the air, halfway to Damien's arm. Damien? What's wrong? Are you angry? The fake sweetness in his voice made me nauseous. Damien didn't look at Julian. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his large hand flat over the napkin, concealing it from his fiancée's view. His fingers spread wide, covering the incriminating words completely. When he raised his eyes, they bypassed Julian entirely and locked dead onto me. I felt like I had been shot. His gaze was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, on my throat, on my very soul. He was assessing me, an unremarkable, suppressant-laced Omega waiter in a starched white uniform, with dishwater brown hair and eyes the color of weak tea. He was looking for the lie, looking for the trap, looking for the angle. I held his gaze. I was terrified. My heart was threatening to crack my ribs, and my hands were shaking so badly I could feel the silver tray rattling against my chest. Sweat was trickling down my spine, soaking through my cheap cotton undershirt. But I didn't look away. I couldn't. I gave a microscopic, jerky nod, projecting every ounce of sincerity I possessed. I'm telling the truth. Please. I'm telling the truth. Nothing is wrong, my love, Damien said smoothly to Julian, and the words were absolutely terrifying in their calmness. He didn't break eye contact with me. His voice was perfectly level, perfectly controlled, masking the absolute violence simmering just beneath the surface. Just a headache coming on. Too many meetings today. Julian's frown deepened. You should take something for that. I told you to delegate more. Caleb, isn't it? Damien's question caught me off guard. He remembered my name. He never looked at me, never acknowledged my existence beyond giving orders, but he knew my name from the small brass name tag pinned to my chest. Yes, sir, I'm managed. You dropped this. Instead of taking the napkin away, instead of crumpling it up or slipping it into his pocket, Damien suddenly reached out and clamped his hand around my wrist. His grip was like a steel vice, firm and unyielding. The heat of his skin burned through the thin cotton of my uniform sleeve. His thumb pressed against the inside of my wrist, right over my pulse point, and I knew. He could feel my heart racing, could feel the terror thrumming through my veins like electricity. Gasped. A soft, pathetic sound that I was immediately ashamed of. He pulled me down slightly, forcing me to lean over the table. My face was suddenly inches from his, close enough that I could see the faint scar cutting through his left eyebrow, could count the flecks of gold in his silver irises. His scent washed over me, cedar and whiskey and storm, and I felt my Omega instinct screaming at me to submit, to bare my throat, to do whatever this alpha wanted. Julian looked on, bewildered and slightly offended. "Damien, what you doing?" "He's just a waiter." "Prove it." Damien's whisper was so low it vibrated directly into my chest, meant only for my ears. His breath was warm against my cheek, smelling of coffee and dark chocolate. "Prove that you're not lying to me, Omega." "I can," I whispered back, my voice shaking. "Give me 5 minutes." Damien stared at me for 1 second longer. 2, 3. His silver eyes bored into mine, searching for deception, searching for the tell that would reveal me as a plant, a liar, an enemy. Whatever he saw, whether it was the absolute terror in my eyes or something else entirely, made him loosen his grip. "Excellent service tonight, Caleb," he said aloud, releasing my wrist and leaning back in his seat. His voice was casual, almost bored. "That will be all." I practically stumbled away from the table, retreating into the shadows of the waitstaff station. I pressed my back against the wall and slid down until I was crouching on the floor, my head between my knees, gasping for breath. I had just handed a note to Damien Blackwood. I had just accused his fiancé of treason. I had just initiated a gang war. I had just signed a death warrant for a high society Omega. And I had absolutely no idea what was going to happen next. From my position hidden behind a decorative pillar, I watched the table. Less than a minute after I walked away, Damien pulled his phone from his pocket. His fingers moved across the screen, typing a single message, maybe 2, and then he put it away. The motion was smooth, unhurried, almost lazy. He smiled at Julian. He raised his glass in a mock toast. Julian smiled back, completely unaware that he was sitting across from the Grim Reaper. At the edge of the dining room, near the bar, a massive alpha in a tailored charcoal suit felt his phone buzz. I recognized him, Marcus Webb, Damien's notoriously lethal right-hand man. He was built like a refrigerator, with a shaved head, cold brown eyes, and the kind of face that had never smiled genuinely in its entire existence. His scent was smoke and leather and something metallic, like blood and gun oil. Marcus looked at his phone. Then he looked at Damien. Then his cold, dead eyes scanned the room until they found me. My blood ran cold. He began walking toward the kitchen. My shift was supposed to end in 20 minutes. I realized, with a sickening drop in my stomach, that I wasn't going to be allowed to clock out. I ducked into the kitchen, throwing my tray onto the counter with a clatter that earned me an angry shout from the head chef. "Foster." What the hell? I ignored him. I needed to get to my locker. I needed to grab my coat and my bag and get out the back alley door. I had warned Damien. My conscience was clear. I didn't want to be around for the fallout. I pushed through the swinging doors into the employee locker room, a dimly lit, narrow corridor in the basement of the building, lined with cheap metal lockers and smelling of mildew and sweat. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting everything in a sickly green glow. I jammed my key into locker 42, ripping the door open. A massive hand slapped flat against the metal locker door, slamming it shut inches from my face. I spun around, crying out in shock. Marcus Webb stood there, blocking the only exit. He was a mountain of a man, at least 6'5", 250 pounds of muscle and ruthlessness. His scent of smoke and leather washed over me, and I felt my Omega instinct screaming at me to run, to hide, to submit. "Going somewhere, little bird?" Marcus asked. His voice was a low rumble, completely devoid of emotion. The nickname hit me like a slap. Little bird. The same nickname Nikolai Volkov had used for Julian. The irony made me want to laugh hysterically. Or throw up. Maybe both. "My shift is over," I lied, backing up until my spine hit the cold metal of the lockers. "I'm going home. The boss wants a word." "Downstairs." I didn't. Marcus didn't wait for my consent. He reached out, his hand closing around my bicep, and practically lifted my feet off the floor. He dragged me toward the service elevator at the end of the corridor, his grip like iron. I struggled. I dug my heels into the linoleum floor, trying to find purchase, trying to slow him down. But I was 140 pounds soaking wet, An Omega who had never been in a fight in his life against an Alpha who snapped necks for a living. It was like a mouse trying to fight a lion. He keyed a code into the elevator panel, and we descended past the basement, past the parking garage, down to a sublevel that definitely wasn't marked on the building's blueprints. The elevator doors opened into a stark concrete-walled room. There was a single metal table, 2 chairs, and a drain in the center of the floor. My stomach heaved. I knew what that drain was for. Damian Blackwood was already there. He had taken off his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing intricate dark tattoos winding up his forearms, patterns that looked like Old Norse runes, intertwined with chains and thorns. His forearms were corded with muscle, his hands large and capable. He was leaning against the table, lighting a cigarette, the flame from his silver lighter casting dancing shadows across his angular face. He looked up as Marcus shoved me into the room. "Leave us, Marcus," Damian commanded softly. "Boss, he's a wild card. We don't know who he's working for." I said, "Leave us." The alpha command in Damian's voice was absolute. It vibrated through the room, through my bones, through my very DNA. It was the voice of an apex predator, an alpha so dominant that his word was law. Marcus nodded once, just a sharp dip of his chin, and backed into the elevator. The heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing Damian and me in together. The silence was deafening. Save for the hum of the ventilation system, there was no sound. No footsteps. No voices. No ambient music from the restaurant above. Just me, Damian Blackwood, and the drain in the center of the floor. Damian took a slow drag from his cigarette, blowing the smoke toward the ceiling. He watched me through narrowed eyes, assessing me the way a predator assesses its prey. Without the presence of other patrons, without the need to maintain appearances, he didn't bother to rein in his pheromones. The air pressure in the room felt like it had doubled. The scent of cedar, whiskey, and lightning was suffocating, primal, demanding submission. I forced myself to stand tall. My legs were trembling violently, and I could feel sweat beading on my upper lip, but I didn't cower. I didn't drop to my knees. I met his eyes, those cold silver eyes, and I held his gaze. Damian reached into his pocket and pulled out the stained napkin. He tossed it onto the metal table. It landed with a soft thwop, the dark wine stain blooming like a wound. "Let's play a game, Caleb," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "It's called, Why Shouldn't I Drown You in That Drain Right Now for Insulting My Fiancé? You have 1 minute. Start talking." "I was getting your wine," I stammered, the words rushing out of me in a flood. I walked past the private parlors. Parlor 7. The door was cracked. Julian was inside. He wasn't alone. Damian's expression didn't change. He took another drag of his cigarette, the tip glowing orange in the dim light. "Go on, Nikolai Volkov. Isait." Damian froze. It was the smallest hesitation, less than a heartbeat, but I saw it. His body went perfectly still, the way a wolf goes still when it catches the scent of danger. "You expect me to believe that my Omega is meeting with a Volkov lieutenant in a public restaurant?" "He told Nikolai about Pier 17, I said, my voice rising, desperate to make him understand. "He said you were moving the weapons shipment tonight at midnight. He said you thought the rail yard was a decoy." Damian's expression remained entirely blank, a terrifying mask. But the scent in the room changed, turned suddenly sharp, laced with a bitter, cold rage that made my Omega instincts curl up and whimper. The detail about the rail yard. That was classified. Only his inner circle knew about the decoy. I had just proven that I knew something I couldn't possibly know, unless I had heard it from Julian's own lips. "Go on," Damian commanded, stepping into my personal space. The heat radiating off his body was intense, almost feverish. His pheromones wrapped around me like a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders, on my chest, on my lungs. "Nikolai asked for the security codes," I continued, forcing the words out. My voice was shaking, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Julian gave them to him. Alpha 7 Tango Niner. Damian stopped breathing. I saw it then. The exact moment the impenetrable armor of the Mafia boss cracked. For a fraction of a second, raw, unguarded betrayal flashed across his eyes. It was there and gone, swallowed by the mask of cold control, but I had seen it. He had given Julian that code. No one outside of his lieutenants knew it. It was a gesture of absolute foolish trust, the kind of trust an alpha gave only to the Omega he intended to bond with. He sold you for $7 million. I finished, my voice dropping to a whisper. Wire to an offshore account by 11 tonight. He told Nikolai to make sure you didn't survive. Because if you live, Julian is a dead man. Damien stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. His cigarette burned down to the filter, ash dropping onto the concrete floor, and he didn't seem to notice. He didn't seem to notice anything except me. Finally, he crushed the cigarette out on the metal table, grinding it into the surface with slow, deliberate pressure. When he looked back at me, the betrayal in his eyes was gone, replaced by something else entirely, something cold and hollow and infinitely terrifying. He reached out. His large hand brushed against my cheek, his knuckles grazing my jawline. I flinched. I couldn't help it, but he didn't pull back. He held me firmly in place, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw, the calluses on his fingers rough against my skin. I should have been terrified. I was terrified. But there was something else there too. Something warm and confusing that bloomed in my chest despite my better judgment. You, Damien said softly, his thumb finding the pulse point on my neck, pressing against it, are a very dangerous little creature. I saved your life, I whispered, daring to look up into his stormy gray eyes. You did. His thumb stroked my skin, sending a confusing jolt of warmth through my terrified panic. Which is a problem. Because if you know enough to save my life, you know enough to end it. He stepped back, pulling his phone from his pocket. The loss of his touch was like stepping out of warm sunlight into cold shadow. Change of plans, he said, dialing a number. The Pier 17 shipment is a trap. Pull everyone back. Lock down the estate. Marcus, bring the car around to the private garage. He hung up and looked at me. Take off the apron, Caleb. You don't work here anymore. What? Panic seized my chest. No, you said, I told you the truth. Let me go. I won't say anything, I swear. I know you won't. Damien's lips curved into a dark, predatory smile. Because you're coming with me? No. If Julian wants to play a game of shadows, we need a new piece on the board. Damien stepped toward me again, and I backed up until I hit the cold concrete wall. He placed his hands on either side of my head, caging me in, his body blocking out the rest of the world. Congratulations, Caleb. You've just been promoted. Promoted to what? To mine. Before I could run, before I could scream or fight or do anything except stare up at him with wide, terrified eyes, the elevator doors chimed open behind me. Damien stepped back, leaving me gasping against the wall. After you, little bird. The ride to the Blackwood estate was conducted in suffocating, heavy silence. I sat in the back of the armored SUV, sandwiched between the reinforced door and the imposing, silent mountain that was Marcus Webb. In the front passenger seat, Damien Blackwood was a silhouette against the passing streetlights, his phone pressed to his ear, issuing rapid-fire commands in what sounded like Russian and English. He was dismantling a gang war before it even started, pulling his men back from Pier 17, securing his assets, identifying potential leaks. I kept my hands folded in my lap to stop them from shaking. My cheap polyester waiter's uniform felt absurdly out of place against the plush, dark leather of the vehicle. I had traded the danger of the restaurant floor for the absolute peril of an Alpha Syndicate boss's inner sanctum. We drove for nearly an hour, leaving the glittering skyline of the city behind and ascending into the affluent, heavily wooded hills of the North Shore. Iron gates, guarded by heavily armed men in tactical gear, swung open to admit us. The estate itself was a sprawling, modern fortress of glass, steel, and dark stone, surrounded by acres of manicured, albeit heavily surveilled, wilderness. It sat on a cliff overlooking the ocean, the waves crashing against the rocks below like nature's own warning system. Out Marcus grunted as the SUV came to a halt in an underground garage filled with luxury vehicles that probably cost more than I would make in 10 lifetimes. I scrambled out, my legs unsteady, following Damien and Marcus up a private elevator that opened directly into a massive, minimalist penthouse-style living area. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the dark ocean churning below the cliffs. Damien tossed his keys onto a marble console table and turned to face me. The adrenaline of the restaurant had faded, leaving him looking exhausted but infinitely dangerous. His silver eyes swept over me, assessing me not as a person, but as a new asset he hadn't yet categorized. "Marcus, secure the perimeter," Damien ordered. "Nobody gets in or out without my explicit authorization. Not even Julian. And give me everything we have on Caleb Foster. Every parking ticket, every credit card statement, every social media post. I want to know his life story by morning." Marcus nodded and vanished down a hallway. Damien walked over to a crystal decanter, pouring himself 2 fingers of amber liquid. He didn't offer me any. "Sit down, Caleb. You look like you're going to faint. And I don't have the patience to scrape you off the floor." I practically collapsed onto the edge of a stark white, low-profile sofa. The cushions were so soft I felt like I was sinking into a cloud. "What do you want from me?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. "I told you what I heard. You're safe. Let me go. Let you go back to a roach-infested studio apartment where Nikolai Volkov's men will inevitably track you down and skin you alive for ruining their coup?" Damien took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze pinning me to the upholstery. "You're not thinking strategically, little bird. You are the only living witness to my fiancé's treason. You are my proof. So I'm a prisoner. You're a guest. Under my absolute protection." Damien's voice was dangerously smooth. "Julian thinks he is playing a game of chess. He thinks he has maneuvered me into a corner. Tomorrow morning, when the sun comes up and I am not a corpse floating in the harbor, he is going to panic. He will look for the leak." Damien set his glass down and closed the distance between us, bracing his hands on the back of the sofa, leaning over me. The heavy scent of cedar, whiskey, and lightning washed over me, demanding submission. "I need to know exactly how deep his betrayal goes," Damien murmured, his voice a low, vibrating rumble. "I need to know who else in my organization he has compromised. If I kill him now, the Volkovs simply find another rat. I have to flush them all out. And to do that, Julian needs to believe he still has the upper hand, while simultaneously losing his absolute mind with paranoia. And where do I fit into this?" I asked, hating how breathless I sounded under the weight of his alpha presence. Damien smiled, a sharp, terrifying expression that didn't reach his eyes. "You, Caleb, are going to be my new personal assistant. You're going to be by my side at my estate, in my meetings. You're going to be the variable Julian never accounted for. He's going to hate me. He's going to try to kill you." Damien's eyes darkened with something that looked almost like possessiveness. "But no one touches what belongs to the Blackwood Syndicate. And as of tonight, Caleb, you belong to me." He straightened up, the oppressive weight of his pheromones receding slightly. "First order of business, those cheap suppressants you're taking. The ones that smell like bleach and give you that sickly pallor. Stop taking them." Panic seized my chest. "I can't. If I go off them, my scent will be natural." "Natural," Damien interrupted, "is exactly what I need. The chemical blockers you buy on the street are poison. They fry your nervous system. I have a private physician. He'll manage your biology safely. But while you are in my house, you will not suppress who you are." "Why?" "Because I need you sharp, Caleb. I need those hypersensitive olfactory receptors of yours fully functional." Damien's silver eyes pinned me in place. "You sniffed out a lie beneath $7 million worth of designer perfume. That is a very rare, very valuable weapon. Don't blunt it." I swallowed hard. Going off suppressants meant exposing my true self, my biological vulnerabilities, to a house full of lethal, dominant alphas. It felt like stripping naked in a room full of wolves. But looking into Damien's unrelenting eyes, I knew I didn't have a choice. "Now," Damien said, turning away, "Beatrice will show you to your room. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we go to war." The withdrawal from the street-level suppressants was brutal. I spent the next 36 hours locked in a luxurious guest suite, silk sheets, marble bathroom, a view of the ocean that made my chest ache with how beautiful it was, shivering through hot and cold flashes as Dr. Vance, the syndicate's stoic, bespectacled beta physician, monitored my vitals and pumped me full of clean, stabilizing fluids. By the morning of the third day, the chemical haze that had clouded my brain for years finally broke. The world crashed over me in a tidal wave of sensory input. Colors were sharper. Sounds were more distinct, every whisper and footstep echoing in my ears. But most overwhelmingly, the scents were agonizingly clear. I could smell the polished mahogany of the furniture, the faint, metallic tang of the weapons the guards carried, the clean, sharp scent of the ocean breeze filtering through the ventilation system, the lingering ghost of the housekeeper's lavender perfume. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, the deep territorial scent of Damien's cedar, whiskey, and lightning. It had permeated every square inch of the estate, marking it as his territory, his domain. For the first time in my adult life, I could smell myself. My natural scent, the one I had been suppressing since I was 18, was nothing like Julian's cloying jasmine or the sweet vanilla that high society omegas seemed to favor. It was grounded, earthy, a sharp, clean scent of petrichor, rain on dry earth, mixed with a faint undertone of crushed mint and old paper. It felt incredibly intimate to have it out in the open air, terrifyingly vulnerable. I spent most of that morning standing in front of the floor-length mirror in my suite, breathing in my own scent, trying to reconcile it with the person I thought I was. I had spent so long hiding, so long pretending to be nothing, that I wasn't sure I remembered how to be someone. Beatrice, a stern older beta woman who acted as the head housekeeper, delivered a wardrobe of tailored, understated clothes. Fine wool slacks, crisp silk button-downs, fitted cashmere sweaters in shades of charcoal and navy and deep forest green. Nothing flashy. Nothing attention-grabbing. Just quality. "Mr. Blackwood requests your presence in the solarium," she stated crisply, not quite meeting my eyes. "He has a guest." Guest. My heart dropped into my stomach. I dressed carefully, my fingers trembling as I buttoned the silk shirt, a deep blue that Beatrice had laid out for me, along with charcoal slacks that fit me like they had been made for my body. I brushed my dishwater brown hair, trying to make it look presentable, and splashed cold water on my face. My eyes in the mirror were wide and scared, the eyes of someone who had no idea what he was walking into. But I couldn't hide in this room forever. I walked down the sweeping glass corridors, my new shoes silent on the polished concrete floors. My newfound senses warned me before I even reached the room. Beneath the overpowering scent of Damien's relaxed alpha dominance was the sickly sweet, rotting stench of panic, masked by white jasmine and honey. Julian was here. I paused at the threshold of the sun-drenched solarium, my heart hammering against my ribs. Julian was pacing like a caged animal, his usually flawless hair slightly mussed, his designer clothes rumpled as if he had been wearing them for days. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed, and his jasmine scent was curdled with fear and desperation. Damien was seated at a glass table, calmly sipping espresso and reading the morning Financial Times. He looked up as I entered, his silver eyes flicking over me once, assessing, cataloging, before returning to his paper. "I just don't understand how there was a complete breakdown in communication, Damien," Julian was saying, his voice high and reedy with manufactured concern. "You were supposed to be at Pier 17. When I heard the police sirens near the docks last night, I was terrified. Why didn't you go? Why didn't you call me?" Damien didn't look up from his paper. "Intelligence suggested a leak, Julian. A rat in the lower ranks. We diverted the shipment to a secure location at the last possible second. It was a chaotic night. My apologies for worrying you." Julian's hands were shaking. He gripped the back of a chair, his knuckles white. The scent of his fear was so pungent I almost gagged. He knew. He knew Damien had survived, which meant Nikolai Volkov was furious, and Julian's $7 million payout was gone. A leak. Julian laughed nervously. Damien, darling, surely you're overreacting. Your men are fiercely loyal. Loyalty is a fluid concept, Damien said softly, finally lowering the paper. His icy eyes locked onto Julian. People get greedy. They think they can outsmart the house. They are always wrong. Damien's gaze shifted over Julian's shoulder, catching me in the doorway. Ah, Caleb. Excellent timing. Julian spun around. His eyes widened as he took me in. The tailored clothes, the absence of my waiter's uniform, the fact that I was standing freely inside Damien Blackwood's heavily guarded private estate. He recognized me instantly from the restaurant. But the context had completely shifted. I wasn't wearing a cheap apron. I wasn't reeking of chemical bleach. And my natural scent, rain and mint and old paper, was filling the air around me, unmasked for the first time in years. Damien, Julian said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, confused register. Who is this? Why is a waiter from the Velvet Rose in your home? Caleb is no longer a waiter, Damien said smoothly, standing up and walking over to me. He placed a large, possessive hand on the small of my back. The heat of his palm through the silk of my shirt sent a jolt straight to my core. He has an exceptionally keen mind for logistics and an unparalleled attention to detail. I brought him on as my personal executive assistant. Julian stared at us, his perfectly contoured face twisting into a mask of pure, ugly jealousy and paranoia. He could smell me now. He could smell that I was an unbonded Omega. And worse, he could smell that Damien's scent had subtly woven itself around mine. A subconscious mark of alpha protection, the kind of territorial claiming that happened automatically when an alpha decided to keep someone close. A personal assistant, Julian sneered, taking a step forward, trying to assert his status. Damien, this is highly inappropriate. We are engaged. You don't bring stray and bonded street trash into our home. My home, Julian. Damien's voice was a lethal whisper. And Caleb stays. His insights have already proven life-saving. Julian flinched as if he had been struck. The blood drained from his face. The words life-saving echoed in the glass room. He looked at me. Really looked at me. And I saw the exact moment the realization hit him. I was the leak. I was the reason the Pier 17 ambush failed. I was the variable he hadn't accounted for. I didn't cower. I stood my ground, leaning slightly back into the solid wall of Damien's chest. I let my own scent flare, just slightly, defiant, grounded rain on dry earth. It's a pleasure to formally meet you, Mr. Ashford, I said, my voice steady, perfectly polite. I look forward to assisting Mr. Blackwood and managing all of his sensitive affairs. Julian's jaw tightened. His jasmine scent curdled further, turning almost sour. I see. He grabbed his designer coat, his hands trembling violently. Well, if that's how it is, I have a fitting for the wedding tuxedo. I'll call you later, Damien. He practically fled the room. The silence after his departure was heavy. Damien removed his hand from my back, and I instantly missed the warmth. He walked over to the window, watching Julian's sports car tear down the driveway, tires squealing on the pavement. He's terrified, I said softly. His scent was practically rotting with it. Good. Damien murmured. Fear makes people sloppy. And sloppy people make mistakes. He turned to look at me, and for the first time, I saw something other than cold calculation in his silver eyes. Something that looked almost like dark amusement. You played that perfectly, Caleb. Sensitive affairs. I think I'm going to enjoy having you around. For the next 2 weeks? I asked because I needed to know. I needed to know how long I had before I became disposable. For as long as it takes, Damien said. And he didn't elaborate. The Blackwood estate became a stage for a high-stakes psychological war. And I was the prime actor. Julian practically moved into the estate, abandoning his own penthouse under the guise of wedding planning. In reality, he was desperate to keep an eye on me and Damien. The dynamic was suffocating. In public, At syndicate dinners, at business meetings, at the endless social events that seemed to fill Damien's calendar, Julian played the doting, oblivious fiancé. He clung to Damien's arm, laughing at his jokes, gazing up at him with adoring eyes. But the moment Damien looked away, Julian's eyes found mine, and they were filled with daggers. Behind closed doors, though, Damien was systematically dismantling Julian's network, and he was using me to do it. I spent hours in Damien's heavily fortified home office, poring over shipping manifests, security rotations, and off-the-books ledgers. To my shock, I was actually good at it. Growing up poor meant I knew how to stretch a dollar, how to spot an inconsistency, how to read between the lines of a hustle. My father had been a small business owner until the Volkovs destroyed him, and he had taught me the basics of accounting before the alcohol rotted his brain. Damien realized quickly that my value went far beyond a keen sense of smell. I was becoming an actual asset to the syndicate. "You missed your calling," Damien said one night, looking over a spreadsheet I had annotated. We were the only two in the office, the rest of the house silent. The clock on his desk read 2:37 a.m. "You should have been an auditor." "I should have been a lot of things," I replied, not looking up from my work. "But poverty doesn't care about potential." Something flickered across Damien's face, something I couldn't read. He didn't respond. He just returned to his papers, and we worked in silence for another hour. The proximity to Damien was doing dangerous things to my biology. We spent late nights huddled over his mahogany desk, his broad shoulders brushing mine, his scent a constant, intoxicating presence in my lungs. He would reach across me to point at something on a document, his arm brushing against my back, and I would have to fight to keep my breathing steady. I caught him staring at me sometimes. His gaze would linger on the curve of my neck, on the way my shirt collar gaped open at the throat, on my hands as they moved across the keyboard. His pupils would blow wide, that telltale sign of an alpha's interest, and his scent would deepen, the whiskey notes becoming richer, the lightning crackling hotter. But he never crossed the line. He was a man of supreme control. Every gesture, every word, every move was calculated. He was waiting for the perfect moment to spring his trap, and I had no idea if I was the prey or the bait. The tension between us built like a storm gathering on the horizon. Every accidental touch felt charged with electricity. Every lingering look felt like a promise. Or a threat. I couldn't tell anymore. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening, a week after I had moved into the estate. Damien had deliberately left a red leather-bound dossier on the edge of his desk. He told me, loud enough for anyone in the hallway to hear, that contained the routing codes for a massive shipment of untraceable bearer bonds moving through the rail yard at midnight on Saturday. "Guard this with your life, Caleb," Damien had said, his eyes locking with mine in a silent command. "I have to meet with Marcus. Do not let anyone into this office." I sat at the desk, pretending to audit a ledger, my heart pounding. Less than 20 minutes later, the heavy oak door creaked open. Julian slipped inside. He looked manic. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair disheveled, and his jasmine scent was sour with desperation. Nikolai Volkov was likely breathing down his neck, demanding compensation for the botched Pier 17 hit. Julian needed a win, a peace offering to give the Bratva. "What are you doing in here, street rat?" Julian hissed, closing the door behind him. "Working, Mr. Ashford," I replied without looking up from my paperwork. As Mr. Blackwood instructed, Julian ignored me. His eyes zeroed in on the red dossier, sitting blatantly on the corner of the desk. He walked forward, reaching for it. I slammed my hand down on top of the leather cover, blocking him. "Mr. Blackwood's orders were clear," I said, my voice hardening. "No one accesses these files. Not even you." Julian glared down at me, his lip curling in disgust. "You arrogant little whore. Do you really think playing house with my alpha gives you authority over me? I am going to be his husband. I am the future of the Blackwood Syndicate. You are just a temporary distraction, a toy he'll discard the second he gets bored of your pathetic, muddy scent." He tried to wrench the dossier from under my hand. I held firm. "If you're the future of this syndicate, Julian, I said quietly. Why are you so desperate to steal from it? Julian froze. His hand hovered over mine. What did you say? I know what you are. I leaned forward, letting him see the utter lack of fear in my eyes. I know you're bleeding him dry. I know you're in bed with the Volkovs. And the second you take this file, Damien is going to know it too. Julian laughed, harsh, jagged sound. You have no proof. It's your word against an Ashford. Who do you think the syndicate will believe? The beloved fiancé, or the gutter trash? With a sudden, violent yank, Julian overpowered me. He ripped the dossier from the desk, flipped it open, and pulled out his phone. His fingers flew across the screen as he snapped photos of the routing codes and transit schedules inside. Enjoy your remaining time in luxury, Caleb, Julian spat, shoving the folder back onto the desk. Because once I'm bonded to Damien, my first order of business is having Marcus dump your body in the river. He turned and practically ran from the office, the door clicking shut behind him. I let out a shaky breath. My hands were trembling as the adrenaline crashed. I reached into my pocket and pressed a button on a small, discreet remote. A hidden panel in the bookshelf slid open. Damien stepped out of the adjoining panic room, his face a terrifying mask of cold, calculated fury. Marcus stepped out behind him, a massive, silent shadow holding a suppressed pistol. Did he take the bait? Damien asked, his voice barely a whisper, yet it commanded the entire room. He took photos of the entire transit schedule. I confirmed, standing up on legs that felt like jelly. Damien looked at the red dossier. The documents inside were entirely real, authentic routing codes, authentic schedules. But the cargo wasn't bearer bonds. It was 4 tons of highly unstable, military-grade C4 explosives, rigged to a dead man's switch. Marcus, Damien said, his eyes never leaving the door Julian had just exited. Mobilize the strike teams. The Volkovs will hit the rail yard at midnight on Saturday, expecting to rob me blind. I want them walking into a slaughterhouse. And I want Nikolai Volkov brought to me alive. And Julian, boss? Marcus asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Damien finally looked at me. The icy fury in his eyes melted into something infinitely hotter, something primal and consuming. His gaze swept over me, lingering on my flushed cheeks, on my heaving chest, on the way my hands were still shaking. Julian has outlived his usefulness, Damien said slowly. When the bombs go off at the rail yard, we arrest him for high treason against the syndicate. He crossed the room, stopping inches from me. The heat of his body washed over me, his scent wrapping around me like a physical embrace. He reached out. His knuckles brushed against my cheek. I should have pulled away. I should have flinched. But instead, I leaned into his touch, my eyes fluttering, half-closed. My own scent, rain and mint, spiked in response to his overwhelming alpha presence, filling the air between us with something warm and desperate. You did perfectly, Caleb, Damien murmured, his thumb tracing my lower lip. You spun the web beautifully. Now we wait for the flies. His head dipped lower, closing the agonizing distance between our lips. I could feel his breath on my mouth, could smell the whiskey on his tongue, could see the storm raging in his silver eyes. And then, Marcus's radio crackled to life with a burst of static that shattered the intimacy. Boss, we have a breach at the southern perimeter. A panicked voice hissed over the comms. It's the Volkovs. They're not waiting for Saturday. They're hitting the estate now. The explosion rocked the foundation of the house before Damien could even respond. The reinforced glass of the office windows shattered inward, raining deadly shrapnel into the room. The shockwave threw me violently backward, my shoulders slamming against the mahogany bookshelves, the impact sending a shockwave of white-hot agony down my spine. The world dissolved into a chaotic slurry of shattered glass, deafening noise, and the acrid, choking smoke of high explosives. Before I could even register the pain, a heavy, solid weight crashed down on top of me, pinning me to the floor. It was Damien. His broad chest shielded my head and torso, his tailored suit instantly dusted with pulverized plaster and glass shards. The overpowering scent of his pheromones, cedar, whiskey, lightning, spiked with the metallic, terrifying tang of pure, lethal alpha protectiveness. It engulfed me, drowning out the smell of the smoke, the blood, the fear. Stay down. Damien roared over the ringing in my ears. Across the ruined office, Marcus was already moving. He had kicked over the massive oak desk, using it as a barricade. In his hands was a sleek, matte black submachine gun, pulled from a hidden magnetic mount under the desk. He unleashed a controlled, deafening burst of suppressing fire toward the shattered windows. They breached the southern wall. Marcus shouted, ejecting a spent magazine and slamming a fresh one home with brutal efficiency. It's a full assault, boss. At least 24 heavily armed hostiles on the lawn. Damien rolled off me, his hand gripping the collar of my shirt and hauling me up into a crouch behind the overturned desk. Blood was trickling down the side of his face from a shallow cut on his temple, but his expression was utterly devoid of panic. He looked like a god of war, eyes blazing with cold, calculating fury. Julian, Damien spat, the name tasting like poison on his tongue. He didn't just take pictures of the dossier. He realized the bearer bonds were a setup. He must have recognized the transit route. He called Nikolai and told him to strike the head of the snake while we were distracted with the fake trap. "We need to move, Mr. Blackwood," I gasped, clutching my aching shoulder. My instincts, honed by years of surviving the worst parts of the city, were screaming at me to run. "Panic room?" Marcus asked, firing another burst into the darkness outside. "No." Damien's voice was steel. "If they have shaped charges capable of blowing my reinforced windows, they have thermite for the panic room door. We'd be trapping ourselves in a steel coffin." We go down to the subterranean garage. The Maybach is fully armored. It can withstand a military-grade assault. We punch through their perimeter and regroup at the secondary safe house. Damien reached down to his ankle holster, producing a compact, lethally precise pistol. He checked the chamber, then looked at me. His silver eyes softened, just for a fraction of a second. The cold Mafia boss flickered, and underneath I saw something else. Something fierce and protective and terrifyingly possessive. "Stay right behind me, Caleb," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Do not let go of me. If I stop, you stop. If I shoot, you cover your ears and stay low. Do you understand?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I reached out and gripped the back of his belt with trembling fingers. "Marcus, lay down cover fire on 3, Damien ordered. 1, 2, 3. Marcus stood up, holding the trigger down, filling the room with a deafening roar and bright muzzle flashes. Damien surged forward, dragging me with him. We burst out of the office and into the sprawling, glass-lined hallway. The estate was a war zone. The beautiful, minimalist architecture I had admired just hours ago was now a deadly trap. Tactical security alarms blared, bathing the corridors in flashing red strobes. Smoke detectors rained a fine mist from the ceiling, making the marble floors slick and treacherous. We moved with terrifying speed. Damien moved like a predator, checking corners, his gun leading the way, his body always positioned between me and the danger. We encountered our first Volkov enforcer near the grand staircase. He was a massive alpha wearing heavy tactical Kevlar and a skull mask, smelling of stale sweat and cheap vodka. Before the man could even raise his assault rifle, Damien fired twice. The silenced thwip-thwip of the pistol was shockingly quiet compared to the chaos around us. The enforcer dropped instantly, 2 neat holes in the center of his throat. My stomach heaved, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I kept my grip on Damien's belt, forcing my legs to move, forcing myself not to look at the expanding pool of blood on the pristine white marble. Through the kitchen, Damien shouted, as the sound of heavy boots echoed from the front foyer. We sprinted through the massive, industrial-grade kitchen. Pots and pans hung like grim wind chimes above the stainless steel islands. The scent of garlic and herbs, left over from the dinner that was supposed to happen tonight, mingled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood. Suddenly, the swinging doors to the servants' quarters slammed open. 3 more Bratva soldiers spilled into the room. Damien shoved me brutally behind a heavy, double-door commercial refrigerator. Gunfire erupted, shattering the tile backsplash and tearing through the stainless steel appliances. Flour and spices exploded into the air, creating a suffocating, blinding cloud of white powder. I huddled against the humming metal of the fridge, clamping my hands over my ears. I could hear Marcus's heavy footsteps behind us, his submachine gun barking in short, deadly bursts. I heard the wet, sickening thud of bodies hitting the floor, the groans of dying men. The metallic scent of blood was so thick in the air, it tasted like rusted iron on my tongue. Clear! Marcus roared. Damien grabbed my arm, pulling me out from behind the fridge. The service elevator is compromised. We take the maintenance stairs down to the garage. Move. We descended into the bowels of the estate. The air grew colder, damper, smelling of concrete and high-octane fuel. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead. The sheer, overwhelming presence of Damien's protective pheromones kept me pushing forward. He was a beacon of lethal safety in the dark. As we reached the heavy, fireproof steel door that led to the underground garage, Damien held up a hand. He pressed his ear against the metal. His expression, when he looked back at Marcus, was grim. "They're already down there," he said quietly. "I can hear the engines." "We bottlenecked them at the door," Marcus suggested, slapping a fresh magazine into his weapon. "No." The word came out of my mouth before I could stop it. Both alphas turned to look at me. My mind, which had spent the last week memorizing every blueprint, every schematic, every security protocol of the Blackwood estate, suddenly snapped into razor-sharp focus. "Damien, the ventilation system," I said, my voice hoarse but steady. "The garage has an industrial halon fire suppression system to protect the classic car collection. If you trigger it, it will suck the oxygen out of the room." Damien stared at me, his eyes widening slightly. "The manual override is in the security booth across the garage," I continued. "I have the master tablet." I pulled the sleek black device from my inside jacket pocket. I hadn't let it out of my sight since I started organizing Damien's files. "It's connected to the estate's localized network. I can override the fire protocols from here. I just need a 10-second delay to let the system cycle." A slow, terrifying, deeply proud smile spread across Damien's bloody face. "You beautiful, brilliant creature," he breathed. He looked at Marcus. "Get your rebreather masks ready. When the doors open, we hold our breath. Caleb, on your mark." I pulled up the security interface, my fingers flying across the glass screen. I bypassed the standard fire alarms, navigating straight into the environmental controls. Halon system armed. Target zone, sublevel garage. Execute. Executing. I breathed, tapping the screen. A deep, mechanical klaxon began to wail from the other side of the steel door. I heard shouts of confusion and Russian, angry, panicked voices demanding to know what was happening. 3. Damien counted down, gripping the handle of the fire door. 2. 1. He yanked the door open. The garage was massive, a sprawling concrete cavern filled with millions of dollars worth of automotive engineering. And it was crawling with Volkov men. At the center of the room, standing behind a phalanx of heavily armed thugs, was Nikolai Volkov himself. He was a bear of an alpha, clad in a tailored black trench coat, holding a heavy revolver. And cowering behind him, looking like a drowned rat in his designer suit, was Julian. The moment the door opened, half a dozen rifles swung toward us. But before anyone could pull a trigger, the ceiling vents exploded with a deafening hiss. Thick, heavy clouds of halon gas pumped into the garage at incredible pressure. It was odorless and colorless, but its effect was instantaneous. The gas didn't just suppress fire. It violently displaced the oxygen in the room. Panic erupted. The Volkov enforcers began to choke, clutching their throats, dropping their weapons as their lungs screamed for air that was no longer there. The engines of the idling getaway SUVs sputtered and died, starved of combustion. Damien and Marcus, having taken massive, lung-filling breaths of clean stairwell air, charged into the fray. It wasn't a firefight. It was a massacre. Moving like ghosts through the panic-stricken, suffocating mob, they neutralized the threats with terrifying, silent efficiency. Hand-to-hand combat. Swift strikes with the butt of a rifle. Precise takedowns. I stayed in the doorway, keeping one foot in the stairwell to breathe the clean air, watching the chaos unfold. Nikolai Volkov, realizing the trap, didn't try to fight. He grabbed Julian by the collar of his suit, using the Omega as a human shield, and began dragging him toward the heavy steel blast doors at the far end of the garage, the secondary exit. Julian was sobbing, struggling to breathe, his usually pristine face twisted into an ugly mask of pure terror. Nikolai, let me go. You said you'd protect me. You are meat, little bird, Nikolai bellowed, his heavy accent distorted by his gasping breath. You failed. You brought me into a slaughterhouse. Damien dropped a choking enforcer and broke into a sprint. His long legs ate up the concrete floor. He vaulted over the hood of a sleek, silver Aston Martin, cutting Nikolai off before he could reach the blast doors. Damien didn't have his gun raised. He stood there, his chest heaving slightly as he held his breath, staring at the man who had ordered the hit on his home, and the Omega who had orchestrated it. The halon system cycled down. The vents slammed shut. The oxygen levels in the room were dangerously low, but breathable enough that people weren't passing out instantly. I stepped out of the stairwell, my heart pounding, moving slowly toward the confrontation. It's over, Nikolai, Damien said. His voice was a low, lethal rasp in the quiet garage. Around them, the surviving Brodva men were groaning on the floor, restrained or unconscious. Nikolai laughed, a wet, rattling sound. He kept his heavy revolver pressed hard against Julian's temple. Julian whined, a pathetic, high-pitched sound, tears streaming down his face. His scent was a rotting, miserable cloud of wilted jasmine and human waste. You think you have one, Sterling? Nikolai sneered. I kill your precious fiancé right here. I take my pound of flesh. Damien tilted his head. His expression was completely blank. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver cigarette case. He extracted a cigarette, placed it between his lips, and lit it with a platinum lighter. Do it, Damien said calmly, blowing a stream of smoke into the stale air. Julian let out a shriek of absolute horror. Damien, no. Please. I did it for us. I was trying to secure the waterfront. You did it because you are a greedy, pathetic parasite, Damien interrupted, his voice laced with venom. He looked at Nikolai. Shoot him, Volkov. You be doing me a favor. I was going to have Marcus take him to the harbor tomorrow anyway. Save me the gas money. Nikolai hesitated. This wasn't the reaction he expected. He was used to leverage. He looked at Julian, then back at Damien, realizing that the Omega in his grip was absolutely worthless. He sold me out to you for $7 million, Damien continued, taking a slow step forward. Then, when he realized I wasn't dead, he sold you out to me. He brought you here to die, Nikolai. Do you really want to protect the rat that chewed through your own ship? Nikolai looked down at Julian with absolute disgust. With a snarl, he shoved Julian forward. Julian stumbled, falling hard onto the concrete floor, scraping his hands and knees. Nikolai moved to raise his gun toward Damien. Damien moved faster. It was a blur of violence. Damien's hand lashed out, gripping Nikolai's wrist, twisting it with a sickening crack of breaking bone. Nikolai roared in pain, dropping the revolver. Damien drove his knee into the larger man's abdomen, followed by a brutal, calculated strike to the jaw that sent the Brodva boss crashing to the floor. Out cold. The silence that followed was absolute. The garage was a graveyard of ruined vehicles and broken men. Damien stood over Nikolai's body, straightening his ruined suit jacket. He dropped his cigarette, crushing it under the heel of his Italian leather shoe. Then he turned his attention to Julian. Julian was scrambling backward on the floor, his designer clothes torn and stained with grease and blood. He looked up at Damien, his eyes wide with a begging, desperate plea. Damien, darling, please, Julian sobbed. You have to understand. I was scared. They threatened my family. Stop lying, Damien commanded softly. The sheer weight of his alpha presence slammed down onto the garage floor. It was suffocating. Julian actually whimpered, curling his body inward, his biology forcing him to submit to the apex predator in the room. "You are stripped of my protection," Damien declared, his voice echoing off the concrete walls, formal, cold, and utterly devoid of mercy. "You are stripped of the Blackwood name. Your family's assets, which you foolishly tied to my holding companies last week, are forfeit. You have nothing. You can't do this." Julian sobbed, clutching at Damien's pant leg. "I'm a high society Omega. You can't just throw me to the wolves." Damien looked down at him with an expression of pure apathy. He kicked Julian's hand away. "I'm not throwing you to the wolves, Julian," Damien said quietly. "I'm leaving you to the rats." He looked at Marcus, who had just finished zip-tying the last of the conscious Volkov men. "Marcus, call the police. Tell them there was a shootout between the Volkov Bratva and an unknown third party in our garage. Let them arrest Julian Ashford for conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism. And make sure the media gets the security footage of him leading armed men into my home." "Boss," Marcus nodded with a grim smile. Damien turned away from the sobbing, broken mess on the floor. He walked toward me. With every step, the cold, ruthless Mafia boss seemed to fade. His shoulders relaxed. The hard set of his jaw softened. By the time he reached me, his silver eyes were warm, exhausted but warm. He reached out. His large, blood-stained hands gently cupped my face. His thumbs brushed over my cheekbones, checking me for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "No," I whispered, my own hands coming up to grip his wrists. "Are you?" "I'm perfectly fine," he murmured. He leaned in, burying his face in the crook of my neck. I gasped as he inhaled deeply, drawing my scent, the sharp, grounding petrichor and mint, into his lungs. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me flush against his chest. His heart was pounding as hard as mine. "You saved my empire tonight, Caleb," he said against my skin. "You saved my life. Again." "I was just doing my job, Mr. Blackwood." Damien chuckled, low vibrating sound against my collarbone. He pulled back, looking deeply into my eyes. His silver gaze dropped to my lips, then back up to my eyes. "I think it's time we renegotiated your contract, little bird," he said softly. And then he kissed me. The cleanup took 3 days. The media circus surrounding the Blackwood estate siege dominated the news cycle, but Damien's lawyers and fixers spun the narrative flawlessly. The official story was a home invasion by a rival criminal organization, thwarted by the quick thinking of the estate security team. Julian Ashford was universally vilified. The golden boy of high society was exposed as a traitorous, greedy conspirator who had orchestrated the attack on his own fiancé. The security footage, showing Julian leading armed men into the estate, was played on every news channel in the country. He was denied bail and locked away in a maximum security federal facility, facing decades behind bars. The Ashford family was publicly disgraced, their assets frozen or quietly absorbed by the Blackwood syndicate as compensation for damages. Nikolai Volkov survived, barely, but his reputation in the underworld was permanently shattered. The Bratva was forced to cede the entire waterfront to Damien to avoid a full-scale, bloody war of annihilation. Through it all, I didn't leave Damien's side. The dynamic between us had irrevocably shifted. I was no longer the frightened waiter, no longer the clever assistant. I was the Omega who had stood beside an apex alpha while the world burned, and had used his own fire to forge a weapon. A week after the attack, the estate had been cleared of contractors and glass repairmen. It was quiet again. I was standing on the grand balcony of the master suite, wrapped in one of Damien's heavy cashmere sweaters, watching the sunset bleed crimson and gold across the ocean. The air was crisp, smelling of salt water and impending rain. I heard the quiet snick of the balcony doors opening. Damien stepped out, holding 2 glasses of an exceptionally rare aged scotch. He handed me one, his fingers brushing mine, lingering just a second longer than necessary. "The final contracts were signed this afternoon," Damien said softly, leaning against the stone balustrade next to me. "The docks are ours. The Volkovs have retreated past the city limits. The board of directors is terrified of me." "Which is exactly how I like it." You built an empire, Damien, I said, taking a sip of the smoky liquid. I secured an empire, he corrected, turning to look at me. The setting sun caught the silver in his eyes, making them burn with a quiet, intense fire. But an empire is a cold thing to rule alone, Caleb. My heart gave a sudden hard thump against my ribs. I looked up at him. The scent of his cedar, whiskey, and lightning was no longer oppressive. It was a heavy, warm blanket that made my omega biology hum with deep, instinctual contentment. Damien reached out, taking the scotch glass from my hand and setting both of our drinks down on the wide stone railing. He turned fully toward me, taking both of my hands in his. His grip was strong, calloused, and incredibly gentle. When you slipped that note onto my table at the Velvet Rose, I thought you were either a dead man walking or a very clever trap, Damien confessed, his voice a low, intimate rumble. I brought you here to use you to flush out a rat. But day by day, sitting across from you in that office, watching you outsmart men twice your size, I stopped looking at you as an asset. He stepped closer, invading my personal space in a way that made my breath hitch. He raised one hand, his knuckles lightly grazing the line of my jaw, pushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. You are the most fiercely intelligent, resilient creature I have ever met, Damien murmured, his gaze dropping to my lips. Julian wore his omega status like a crown of glass, fragile and demanding. You wear yours like armor. You don't cower. You don't hide your true scent with poison anymore. You smell like rain, like life after a storm. He leaned in closer. I don't want an assistant anymore, Caleb. I don't want a guest. I want a partner. An equal. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. I want to formally request the right to court you, to bond with you. If you will have me. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes. In the ruthless, transactional world of the Omegaverse, alphas took what they wanted. They commanded. They demanded. But the most dangerous, lethal mafia boss in the city was standing before me, asking for my consent. I didn't answer with words. I closed the final inch between us and pressed my lips to his. Damien groaned, a deep, primal sound that vibrated straight through my chest. His arms wrapped around my waist, pulling me flush against his hard, muscular body. The kiss was consuming, a clash of heat and dominance softened by a desperate, overwhelming reverence. He kissed me like I was the only solid thing in his violent world. My scent flared, a heavy, intoxicating wave of petrichor and mint, weaving seamlessly into his cedar, whiskey, and lightning. It was a biological lock and key, perfectly matching, perfectly balanced. When we finally broke apart, breathless, Damien rested his forehead against mine. He smiled, a genuine, rare expression that transformed his harsh features into something devastatingly handsome. I'll take that as a yes, he whispered. I'm not going to be a quiet little housewife, Damien. I warned him, breathless laugh escaping me. If I'm staying, I want to audit the shipping manifests. Your quartermasters are sloppy. Damien threw his head back and laughed, a rich, booming sound that echoed out over the cliffs. He pulled me tight against his side, kissing the top of my head. You can audit whatever you want, my love, he promised, his eyes tracking the dark horizon. We are going to rule this city together. Let them try to take it from us. Standing there, wrapped in the arms of a monster who treated me like a king, I knew my life would never be safe. It would be violent, chaotic, bathed in blood and shadows. But as the first drops of rain began to fall from the evening sky, matching the scent that bound us together, I knew I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. Then,